AS economics. There is one topic in AS economics that often causes confusion to those who want to draw the diagrams. And this topic is about the imposition or removal of indirect taxes and subsidies. So let's begin with imposition of indirect tax. I will like to draw the diagrams in this video so that you can practice them at home, and when you draw them in the examination or in the examination paper, you don't make a mistake which many candidates make. So let's make the diagram for the imposition of indirect tax. Before you draw the diagram, I'm sure you are aware that you must give the example and definition of indirect tax. Indirect tax is a tax that is on expenditure and that is payable when people buy something or they spend money on buying something. The examples of indirect tax are sales tax, value-added tax, which we often call VAT, or GST, that is general sales tax, import tariff, that is also an example of indirect tax. Indirect taxes are usually meant to reduce the quantity of demerit goods, or they are meant to generate revenue for the government. The governments often impose indirect taxes on oil to generate revenues and also to conserve the consumption of oil. So let's focus on the diagram now. Along x-axis is the quantity, along y-axis is the price, initial demand curve and initial supply curve is D1 and S1. Initial price and initial quantity. Remember, always show the initial equilibrium before you show any shift. Often candidates miss showing the initial equilibrium. So initial supply curve is S1, that is before the imposition of tax. The imposition of tax, before the imposition of tax, the equilibrium price is P1 for the consumers and it is also P1 for the producers. Price for consumer and producer is exactly the same as there are no taxes, and the quantity is Q1. After the tax, supply curve shifts upward with the amount of tax. Supply curve shifts upward with the amount of tax. You can either show an arrow which is showing toward the left shift, or you can also show an upward shift arrow sign. So that will raise the price to P2 for the consumers. So price for consumer will go to P2 as the supply curve has become S2. Now supply curve, this supply curve S2 is equal to S1 plus the amount of tax. T is the amount of tax. So when you add the supply, when you add the tax in the supply curve S1, you get S2. So the vertical distance between these two supply curves, the vertical distance between these two supply curves is the amount of tax. Now the price paid by the consumer is P2, but it is not the price received by the producer. Producer will receive this price minus the amount of tax. How do we find out the tax amount and the price received by the producer? That is the vertical distance. So if we deduct from this price P2 the amount of tax, now this vertical line, this blue line is the amount of tax. This blue line is the amount of tax per unit. So when you deduct P tax amount from P2, you get the price P3. Now this P3 price is the price for the producers. They are getting a low price. So remember, when taxes are imposed, prices rise. But for the consumer, for the producers, prices fall. And the quantity falls to quantity Q2. So Q2 would be the quantity. So this is first part of our video. The second part of our video is about the removal of indirect tax. So let me redraw this diagram. Now this segment of the video is about the removal of indirect tax. So the impact of introducing tax is discussed separately. Now we move to discuss the removal of indirect tax. So first of all, we draw the initial demand and supply curve. Remember, whenever you show initial demand and initial supply curve, you must show the equilibrium. So before the removal of tax, so understand, before the removal of tax means price with tax. So before removal means with tax. After removal is without tax. So with tax, the price paid by the consumer is P1 and the supply curve is S1 and the quantity is Q1. But the tricky part is to identify the price for the producers. You need to know what is the price. Before we do and identify the price for the producer, we need to draw another supply curve. And that supply curve would be after the removal of indirect tax. So after the removal of indirect tax, without taxes, supply curve would be S2, and that would be a lower supply curve as decrease in taxes or removal of taxes, lower cost of production and shift supply curve downward to S2. You can show either a rightward arrow sign or a downward arrow sign. So that has led to the quantity which is higher. So quantity would be Q2 and the supply curve is S2. Now the price for the consumer is P2 after the tax, after the removal of tax. Without tax for the consumer is P2. The tricky part, as I said earlier, is the identification of the price for the producer with tax, that is before the removal, and without tax, that is after the removal of indirect tax. So this was the price consumers were paying initially, P1. Which price producers were getting? Producers were not getting this price. They were getting this price minus the tax amount. So what is the tax amount? The tax amount was this supply curve. The distance between two supply curves, the vertical distance, again, the blue marker line will show this is the tax amount. So the producers were receiving price P3 before the tax. So before the removal of tax, before the removal of tax, consumers were paying P1, but producers were getting P1 minus tax amount P3. After the removal of tax, now there is no tax. Tax is completely removed. Price paid by consumers is P2, and that also becomes the price received by the producers. So remember, when taxes are imposed, price rises for consumers and falls for the producer. But when taxes are removed, price falls for the consumer and rises for the producer. So this is how you need to draw a diagram to show the effect of removal of indirect tax. This part of the video is about the effects of a subsidy on consumers and producers. So subsidy is a financial grant, and that is often given to encourage the production and consumption of a product. It could be for a merit good, it could be for an essential food item, and it could be for an agricultural product, and the purpose would be either to raise the production or encourage producers to produce more or encourage consumers to buy more of that product. So let's show the effect of a subsidy with the help of a demand and supply diagram. So remember to show the initial equilibrium clearly before you show any shift. So initial demand curve is B1, initial supply curve is S1, initial price is P1, and initial quantity is Q1. So before the subsidy, supply curve was S1, price for consumer for P1, and it was the exactly same price producers were receiving because there is no subsidy. Price paid by consumer was exactly equal to the price received by the producer, and quantity was Q1. After the subsidy, cost of production falls and supply curve shifts downward S2, and that is a rightward or a downward shift in supply curve. The supply curve is now S2. This is because of lower cost of production. Subsidy has decreased the cost of production. The price for consumer would fall to P2 and the quantity would rise to Q2. For the consumer, price would be P2, and for the consumers, for the quantity would rise from Q1 to Q2. Now, what will be the price for the producer? Now, that is the tricky part, and many students miss that. To identify the price received by the producer, you need to add subsidy into the price that is being paid by the consumers. So, price paid by the consumer is P2. We need to add the subsidy, and the subsidy is the vertical distance between two supply curves. So keep adding subsidy, and this black line shows the amount of subsidy per unit, and this is the price P3, that is the price for the producers after the subsidy. Remember, after the subsidy, price for the consumers falls, but price for the producers rises, and the price paid by consumer plus subsidy is the price received by the producers. We can also draw a hypothetical line here, as this will help us identify the producers' additional revenues because of subsidy, and consumers saving in expenditure because of subsidy, but that is a separate discussion. At the moment, we've only told you the impact of a subsidy on the supply curve, on the price for the consumers, and on the price for the producers, and on the quantity. Remember, price paid by the consumer is the price that is the market price. So if there is a question about market price, the market price was P1 before the subsidy. After the subsidy, it has gone down to P2. This part of my video is about the effects of removal of subsidy. So as I keep saying, draw the initial equilibrium clearly before you show any shift. So initial demand and supply curve in the panel of quantity and price show the initial equilibrium, that is S1 and D1, and the initial equilibrium price is Q1. Initial equilibrium price is P1 and the quantity is Q1. So price supply curve before the removal of subsidy was S1, price for the consumer was P1, and the quantity was Q1. Now this price is with the subsidy because it is before the removal of subsidy. So it is with subsidy. And we will of course discuss what will happen without subsidy. So we have left one area blank intentionally, and that is price for the producers. Because price for the producer would be this price plus the subsidy amount. But at the moment, we do not know what is the subsidy amount. Subsidy amount is the vertical distance between two supply curves. So we need to draw the other supply curve. When the subsidy is removed, it raises cost of production. The impact is similar to the imposition of an indirect tax. So when cost of production rises, supply curve shifts to the left, or supply curve shifts upward by the amount of subsidy that has been taken off now, that has been removed. The supply curve without subsidy is a higher one, and that is S2. And the price for the consumer would rise to P2, and that is P2 is the price for the consumer, and the quantity would also fall to Q2, and we show it graphically, the quantity would fall to Q2. So for the consumer, price has gone up from P1 to P2. But the tricky part is the price for the producers. So what was the price producers were receiving when there was a subsidy? Before the removal of subsidy, which price producers were getting? Producers were getting P1 plus subsidy amount. This was P1, and the subsidy amount is the vertical distance between two supply curve. So price producers were getting. Now let me extend the diagram so that I can show it clearly. S2 here. So this black dotted line, and now it make it a complete one. Now this black line shows the amount of subsidy per unit. So before the subsidy was removed, and when there was subsidy available, producers were getting not only the price that consumers were paying, that was P1, they were also getting the subsidy, and they were getting price of P3. This was the price producers were getting before the subsidy was removed, before the subsidy was taken off, and it was the price that included the amount of subsidy. So consumers were paying P1, but producers were getting P1 plus subsidy, P3. Black line is the amount of subsidy per unit. After the subsidy removal, now without the subsidy, there is no subsidy now, price paid by consumer is P2, and it is the same for the price paid for the consumer is P2, it is same for the producers, and that is P2. So when subsidy is removed, price for consumer rises from P1 to P2, price for the producers falls from P3 to P2. Quantity falls. And when subsidy is granted, price for consumers falls, and price for producer rises. That's a separate video. I hope you understood the diagrams. But remember, draw a hypothetical line here because that will help you to identify the impact on consumer and producers' revenues and expenditures, and it will also help you to identify the impact of consumer and producer surplus because of subsidy or because of the removal of subsidy. That's a separate video. Thank you very much.